I bought a strip of land nobody wanted, a narrow, forgotten shortcut between two streets. I didn't know it yet, but I had just bought the one piece of land an entire HOA depended on every single day. Within a week, 300 people who'd never spoken to me suddenly needed my permission to get to work on time. If you love watching entitled HOAs face consequences they never saw coming, subscribe now, because this shortcut turned into the most powerful piece of leverage I've ever owned. It started as a joke, honestly. I was scrolling through county surplus land auctions late one night, half paying attention, when I saw it, a narrow half-acre strip listed simply as unused right-of-way parcel. No description, no photos, starting bid, almost nothing. Curious, I looked up the parcel number on a map, and that's when I laughed out loud. It was a shortcut, a literal cut-through connecting a residential neighborhood, Brookstone Estates, directly to the main road. Instead of driving the long way around through two stop signs and a four-way intersection, residents had apparently been cutting through this strip of land for years to save themselves 5 minutes every single morning. 5 minutes doesn't sound like much, until you realize an entire community had built their daily routine around it. I placed the bid almost as a joke. Nobody else did. 3 days later, I got the notification. Sold. I was now the owner of Brookstone Estates' favorite shortcut. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured I'd maybe put up a small fence, maybe not even bother, and just let people keep using it like they always had. It wasn't like I had big plans for a half-acre strip of grass between two streets. But then I made the mistake of mentioning it to a friend who lived 2 neighborhoods over. "Wait," she said, practically choking on her coffee. "You bought the shortcut? The Brookstone cut through?" Yeah. Why, is that a big deal?" She laughed so hard she had to put her coffee down. "You have no idea what you just bought. That HOA has fought with the county for years trying to get that strip turned into an official road. They've literally built their entire morning commute strategy around cutting through there. If you close that off, you're going to start a war." I didn't believe her. Not really. Not until I drove out to see the land in person next morning and watched in real time an unbroken line of cars cutting directly across what was now legally my property, one after another like clockwork, without a single person even glancing over to check if anyone on the land they were driving through. Nobody stopped. Nobody hesitated. This wasn't occasional convenience. This was routine, daily, entitled. I stood at the edge of my new property, watching car after car roll past just feet from where I stood, and felt something shift in me. Not anger exactly, more like curiosity. What would happen if all of this just stopped? I didn't act on it right away. I wanted to understand what I was actually dealing with first. So I pulled county records, looked up the original road plans, and discovered something even more interesting than I expected. This strip of land had never been a public road, never officially dedicated, never maintained by the county, never legally guaranteed as an access point for anyone. It had simply been vacant land that the HOA's own developer had used temporarily during construction 15 years ago, and residents had just kept using it, indefinitely, without permission, without ever formalizing anything, which meant every single car cutting through that land every single morning was trespassing, and now all of that trespassing depended entirely on one thing: me. I sat in my car that evening, watching the sun set over a piece of land that suddenly felt a lot more powerful than a random half-acre auction purchase. 300 households, one shortcut, zero legal right to use it. I picked up my phone and typed out a single question into the county planning office's contact form, one that I suspected was about to change absolutely everything for an entire neighborhood. Is there any existing easement agreement on parcel 114B Brookstone Estates cut-through? The reply came back faster than I expected. No easement on file. Parcel is entirely private. I stared at that message for a long time, because now I wasn't just the owner of an empty strip of land. I was the one person standing between 300 families and the shortcut they'd built their entire mornings around. The email confirmation sat glowing on my screen. No easement. Entirely private. Which meant I had just accidentally acquired the single most valuable half-acre in the entire county, not because of what it was, but because of what everyone else needed it for. I didn't do anything right away. I wanted to see it for myself first, really see it, not just glance at traffic from the roadside. So, the next morning, I parked my car at the far end of the strip before sunrise, coffee in hand, and just watched. By 6:45 a.m., the first car came through. Then another. By 7:15, it was a steady stream. Minivans, SUVs, delivery trucks, even a school bus driver who clearly used this route every single day without a second thought. I counted 43 vehicles in 1 hour. 43 households, depending on land they had zero legal right to use, treating it like it was as permanent and guaranteed as the road in front of their own homes. That's when I noticed something else. A worn dirt path along the edge of the strip, not for cars, but for people. Joggers, dog walkers, parents pushing strollers. This wasn't just a driving shortcut. It was woven into the entire rhythm of the neighborhood's daily life. I sat there thinking about what my friend had said. You have no idea what you just bought. She wasn't exaggerating. This wasn't a random parcel of land. This was the load-bearing wall of an entire community's routine. I still hadn't decided what I wanted to do with it. Part of me thought about just leaving things alone, letting people keep using it like they always had, changing nothing, becoming a landowner nobody even noticed. It would have been the easy thing to do. But then, 3 days after my purchase, I got a knock on my actual front door. Not at the land, at my house, 20 minutes away. A man in his 50s stood on my porch, wearing a golf polo with an HOA logo stitched on the chest, holding a folder of papers like he'd rehearsed this moment in his car. "Are you the new owner of Parcel 114B?" he asked, no greeting, no introduction. "Depends who's asking," I said. "Rick Donnelly, Brookstone Estates HOA president." He held out the folder like it was supposed to intimidate me. "We need to discuss formalizing an access agreement for the community shortcut." I hadn't announced the purchase publicly. I hadn't posted about it anywhere, which meant one very obvious question. "How did you find my home address?" He hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. County records are public. Technically true. But something about the way he said it, fast, rehearsed, like he'd practiced dodging that exact question, told me this wasn't just a friendly neighborhood visit. This was damage control. And damage control only happens when someone's worried about something they should have handled a long time ago. "I haven't even decided what I'm doing with the land yet," I said honestly. Rick's expression shifted just slightly, somewhere between relief and calculation. "Well, we'd like to make sure whatever you decide includes continued access for residents. It's important to the neighborhood." "Important how?" He paused again, longer this time. "It's just how things have always worked," he said carefully. "Nobody's ever had a problem with it before." Nobody's ever had a problem with it before. That phrase stuck with me long after he left, papers still tucked under his arm, promising to follow up soon in a tone that sounded a lot more like a warning than a courtesy. Because if nobody had ever had a problem with strangers driving across private land every single day for 15 years, that almost certainly meant nobody had ever bothered checking who actually owned it. Until now. The silence in that clubhouse stretched long enough that I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. A woman near the back, the same one who'd stopped her car at the sign a few days earlier, finally spoke up. "Wait, you knew this wasn't legal? 6 years ago?" Rick shifted in his seat. It's more complicated than that." "It's really not," I said. "Your own minutes say legal counsel advised against pursuing an easement due to cost. That's not complicated. That's a decision to let 300 households trespass daily instead of spending money to do it properly." Another resident, an older man near the front, crossed his arms. "So, this whole time, if something happened out there, an accident, a kid getting hurt, that was on us? Not the county, not some public road agreement. It would have been on whoever owned the land." I said, "For 15 years, that was random and unclear. Now it's just me." Which is exactly why I put up those signs. Rick tried to regain control of the room. The board is prepared to offer fair compensation for a formal easement, ensuring continued access while protecting Mr. Whitfield from liability going forward. Define fair, I said. He named a slightly higher number than his attorney had offered on the phone. Still low. Still treating this like a minor inconvenience instead of what it actually was, 15 years of unauthorized use they'd known about and ignored. I looked around the room instead of answering him directly. Can I ask everyone something? How many of you knew this land wasn't officially part of your neighborhood? That there was never a real agreement, never an easement, nothing legally guaranteeing you could use it? Silence. A few people shook their heads slowly. That's the problem, I said. Not that I bought this land. Not that I put up a sign. The problem is your own leadership let you build your entire daily routine around something that could disappear at any moment and never once told you the truth. Rick's jaw tightened. That's not fair. Neither is finding out 6 years too late that the people you trusted to protect this community's interests chose convenience over honesty, I said. The room shifted again, not against me this time, but against him. I watched something happen that I hadn't fully expected walking in that night. Residents weren't just upset about the shortcut anymore. They were upset about being kept in the dark. An hour of tense back and forth later, the board agreed to something far different than what they'd walked in offering. Not just compensation for an easement, full transparency, a public accounting of when the board first knew about the legal risk distributed to every household, along with a genuinely fair, professionally appraised payment for the easement rights. Rick didn't look thrilled, but he didn't have a choice anymore. Not with an entire room of residents now watching him with the same suspicion I'd walked in with 3 hours earlier. As the meeting broke up, the woman from the car pulled me aside, quietly. "Thank you for telling us the truth," she said, "even if it wasn't the answer we wanted." I nodded, gathering my papers, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel walking into that room. Not triumph exactly, something closer to relief. Because the story wasn't really about a shortcut anymore. It was about an HOA that had built 15 years of comfort on top of a truth they never wanted their own residents to see, and one random land auction that finally forced it into the light. But as I walked to my car that night, papers tucked under my arm, my phone buzzed with a text from Linda, my attorney. "Just found something you need to see. Call me first thing tomorrow." It's about the original developer, not the HOA. I stopped in the parking lot, staring at that message. Because apparently, the story wasn't finished yet. There was another player in this 15-year secret. One nobody in that clubhouse had mentioned at all. The HOA's attorney introduced himself in the clipped, overly formal tone lawyers use when they're trying to sound more threatening than they actually are. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm calling regarding the signage recently installed on Parcel 114B. The Brookstone Estates community has relied on that access point for over 15 years. We'd like to discuss a resolution before this escalates." Escalates. Like I was the one causing a problem, instead of the one who'd just discovered 15 years of unauthorized use of my own property. "There's nothing to escalate," I said calmly. "It's private property. I'm well within my rights to restrict access." "Legally, that's true," he admitted, which surprised me. I expected more resistance. But practically speaking, closing this access point would create significant disruption for hundreds of residents. "We're hoping to find a solution that works for everyone." "I'm listening," I said. There was a pause, like he hadn't actually expected to get this far in the conversation. The board would be willing to discuss a formal easement agreement, reasonable compensation, clearly defined terms, liability protections for you as the landowner. Reasonable compensation. 6 years ago, they decided this exact thing was too expensive to pursue voluntarily. Now, faced with losing access entirely, suddenly the cost didn't seem so unreasonable anymore. "What kind of compensation are we talking about?" I asked, genuinely curious how much an HOA would pay to fix a problem they'd created themselves. He named a number. It was insulting, honestly, considering 15 years of free use and the liability I'd now be shouldering. I almost laughed. "That doesn't come close to covering 15 years of unauthorized use," I said, "or the legal exposure I've been carrying since the day I bought this land, completely unaware 300 households were trespassing across it daily. "We can discuss adjusting the terms," he said quickly, his composed tone slipping just slightly. "I think we should," I said, "but not over the phone. I want this in writing, formally with the full board present. And I want documentation of exactly how long this arrangement has existed, since apparently there are meeting minutes proving the board knew this wasn't legal and chose to ignore it anyway." Silence. Real silence. The kind that tells you someone on the other end just realized you know more than they hoped you did. I'm not sure that documentation is relevant to... "It's very relevant," I said, "especially if this ends up in front of a judge instead of a negotiating table." The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening inside the Brookstone Estates Community Clubhouse. I almost didn't recognize the version of myself who walked into that room. Calm, prepared, holding printed copies of county records, easement law, and 6-year-old meeting minutes the board probably wished they'd never written down. The clubhouse was packed. Not just board members, dozens of residents had shown up too, word having apparently spread through the neighborhood faster than the HOA could control. Rick sat at the head of the table, noticeably less confident than the man who'd shown up at my front door with a folder of papers and false authority. "Mr. Whitfield," he started, forcing a diplomatic tone, "we appreciate you coming tonight to discuss." Before we start, I interrupted, sliding a printed page across the table. "I think everyone here should see this." It was the meeting minutes, the ones proving the board had knowingly avoided formalizing legal access 6 years earlier, choosing convenience over responsibility. The room went dead silent as residents leaned forward, reading words their own HOA board had written and apparently hoped nobody outside that meeting would ever see. Rick's face went pale, because in that clubhouse, surrounded by the very people who'd trusted his leadership for years, everyone was about to learn exactly how long their harmless shortcut had actually been a ticking legal liability, one their own board had known about and buried instead of fixing. Nobody's ever had a problem with it before kept replaying in my head for days. Because the more I thought about it, the more it sounded less like reassurance and more like a confession. I decided to do some digging of my own before Rick followed up again. I started with the HOA's public meeting minutes, which, conveniently for me, were archived online going back almost a decade. And buried in a set of minutes from 6 years ago, I found something that made my stomach turn. Board discussed formalizing shortcut access with county. Legal counsel advised against pursuing official easement due to cost and liability concerns. Motion tabled indefinitely. They knew, 6 years ago, the HOA board had specifically discussed making this access legal, and specifically chose not to. Not because they couldn't, because it was cheaper and easier to just keep using land they didn't own and hope nobody ever noticed. For 6 years, they had knowingly let 300 households trespass daily rather than spend the money to do it properly. I sat back in my chair, feeling something click into place. This wasn't an innocent misunderstanding anymore. This was a board that had made a calculated decision to gamble with other people's legal exposure, including mine apparently, since I was now the one holding a decade and a half of unresolved liability. If someone got into an accident on that shortcut, who was responsible? If a kid on a bike got hurt crossing my property, who got sued? Legally, morally, financially, none of that trespassing risk had ever belonged to Brookstone Estates. It had always belonged to whoever owned the land, which was now me. That changed everything. I called Linda, the same sharp property attorney who'd helped me untangle prescriptive easement claims before, and laid out everything I'd found. "This is actually incredibly common," she said. "HOAs love using land they don't own because it's free until it isn't. The second something goes wrong, or the second the actual owner asserts their rights, the whole arrangement falls apart instantly, because there was never anything legally binding it together in the first place. So, what are my options? Honestly, almost unlimited," she said. "You could grant a formal easement for a price. You could restrict access entirely. You could allow pedestrian access but block vehicles. You could sell the land back to the HOA at whatever price you want, since they clearly need it far more than you do. That last option sat differently than the others, because Rick hadn't come to my door offering to buy the land. He'd come to my door assuming continued free access was simply owed to them. 15 years of entitlement will do that to a community. It stops feeling like a favor and starts feeling like a right. I decided it was time they understood the difference. That weekend, I had a sign professionally made, sturdy, official, unmistakable, and drove out to install it myself at both entrances of the strip. Private property. No trespassing. Violators subject to fines and legal action. I didn't block the path yet. I didn't need to. I just wanted them to see it. To really see it. The way I had that first morning watching 43 cars roll through like the land had always belonged to them. I finished installing the second sign just as a car slowed down beside me, a woman maybe mid-30s staring at the sign with visible confusion. "Wait," she said, leaning out her window. Are they closing the shortcut?" "Depends," I said. "Are you planning on asking permission first?" Her confusion turned into something sharper, something that looked a lot like the exact reaction Rick had probably been dreading since the day I bought this land. Because within an hour of me putting up 2 signs, my phone was already ringing. And this time, it wasn't Rick. It was the HOA's attorney. I called Linda at exactly 8 a.m. the next morning, coffee untouched, stomach already tight with anticipation. "What did you find?" I asked before she could even say hello. So I went back further than the HOA's meeting minutes, she said. I wanted to understand why this strip of land existed as an unused parcel in the first place. Turns out, it wasn't leftover land from construction like everyone assumed. Then what was it? It was supposed to be a real road, she said. Fully planned, fully permitted, connecting Brookstone Estates directly to the main road exactly where your shortcut sits now. The original developer even paved the base layer before construction mysteriously stopped. Why would they stop building an actual road? Linda paused. Because building the shortcut as an unofficial dirt cut-through was cheaper than finishing it as a real one, and once residents started using it anyway, the developer realized he could sell the neighborhood without ever finishing that final infrastructure cost. He pocketed the savings, sold the last few homes, and quietly walked away, leaving the county, the HOA, and eventually you holding a legal gray area nobody ever intended to create. My stomach turned. So the HOA didn't just ignore a legal risk. They inherited one the developer created on purpose to save money. Exactly, she said. And here's the part that actually matters for you. Because the road was originally planned and partially constructed as a public access point, there may be a legitimate case that the county, not you, and not the HOA, bears some responsibility for finishing what was promised, which means you may have grounds to force a resolution that doesn't just benefit you financially, but forces the county to finally do what should have been done 15 years ago. I sat back, letting that sink in. This wasn't just a story about a shortcut or an HOA cutting corners, or even a developer disappearing with a quiet profit. This was 15 years of an entire system, developer, HOA, and county, all quietly agreeing not to notice a problem, because noticing it would have cost somebody money, and the only reason any of it was surfacing now was because one random online auction had put that forgotten strip of land into the hands of someone who actually asked questions. 2 weeks later, armed with Linda's research, I sat down with a county planning representative, not to fight, but to lay out exactly what I now knew. The original road plans, the developer's decision to abandon construction, 15 years of unofficial use that everyone had simply agreed to overlook. The county's response surprised me. They didn't fight it. They couldn't. The paper trail was too clear, and the liability exposure for continuing to ignore an unofficial, unmaintained access point serving 300 households was far greater than the cost of finally finishing the job that should have been completed a decade and a half earlier. 6 months later, construction crews arrived, not to close the shortcut, but to finally build the real road that had been promised 15 years before. Paved, lit, maintained by the county, legal, permanent, and finally, genuinely safe for the families who'd been driving across an unofficial dirt path for far too long. As for me, I sold the land to the county for a fair, professionally negotiated price, not the insulting number Rick had first offered, and not some inflated demand out of spite either. Just what it was actually worth. For the actual risk, I'd unknowingly carried the moment I clicked place bid on a random online auction. Rick wasn't re-elected the following year. The HOA implemented new transparency policies, publishing meeting minutes in real time instead of burying them in archives nobody checked. And every morning now, when I drive past Brookstone Estates, I see families using a real road. One with actual signage, actual maintenance, and an actual legal foundation instead of 15 years of quiet trespassing everyone had simply agreed to pretend was normal. Sometimes the smallest, most forgotten piece of land holds the biggest truth an entire community has been avoiding. All it takes is one person willing to actually ask who it belongs to. If this story hit you the way it hit me telling it, make sure you're subscribed, because the next HOA story I bring you might expose something even bigger than this one.